Good evening, good morning, good afternoon. My name is Julie Nash, and I am the immediate past president of ISMTE, and I'm joined here today by Diana Jones, who's the executive publisher at Elsevier, and Brit Stamey, who's the copy editing service coordinator at J&J Editorial. Today's topic is going to be case studies in DEI, what has worked in the editorial office. And before we get started, I am going to just go through a couple housekeeping things. Many of you may be sick of hearing this by now, but I'm going to go through them anyway. So we're going to do all questions at the end of the session. If you want to direct your question to a specific speaker, just use the @ sign and then the speaker's name, and we will send that question to that particular person. Feel free throughout the entire event, though, to enter any questions that you have in the Q&A function, and we will pick those up from there. So as before we get started here, I'm going to quickly post a poll. Diana's going to start speaking, but as she gets started, you can go ahead and enter that poll. So I have it here, but I will kick out of my slides here in a second. Our question for our poll is, have you, your organization, already implemented journal DEI initiatives? And we'll come back to that in just a little bit. So with no further ado, I'm going to close out my slides here and turn it over to Diana.
Thank you very much. I'll just share my screen. All good? Can everyone see that? Okay, thank you so much, Julie. Now, I'm based in Australia, so before I start my presentation, I'd firstly just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land I'm on today, which is the Gadigal peoples of the Eora Nation. I'd like to thank everyone for taking the time to join the session today, where we'll be covering the important topic of improving diversity, equity, and inclusion in journals. I also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you're on today, and any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders participating in this conference. I pay my respects to elders past and present, and I celebrate the rich history and culture of Aboriginal peoples and their connections to the lands and waters throughout Australia. So by way of introduction, here's a little bit of information about me. As you can see, I'm a little bit of an international wanderer. I sort of followed my parents around the world growing up. And I think that gave me a wonderful opportunity to experience different cultures. And I think it may well have sowed the seed for my interest in both psychology and diversity, equity, and inclusion. I've spent most of my career working in STM publishing in both UK and Australia. And I'm currently an executive publisher at Elsevier, managing a portfolio of health science journals, which are owned by societies. I'm also an inclusion and diversity champion within Elsevier's STM journals group. So I'm involved in a few of the initiatives I'll be mentioning today, but by no means all of them. And I only really have a sort of brief overview knowledge of a lot of them. So apologies for that, but I'd like to thank my colleagues for helping me with all the information that I put together for this presentation. Finally, I'm proud to be involved in RELX Australia's First Nations Employee Resource Group, which aims to learn, recognise and share the unique cultural identity, contributions, traditions and issues facing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples in Australia, and to promote reconciliation. This is one of over 100 groups within RELX, which is actually the parent company of Elsevier around the world. They're independent, voluntary groups of employees who share common interests and contribute to fostering an inclusive environment and promoting diversity and inclusion in the workplace. So the outline of my presentation, why DEI in research is important. I'm going to cover a little bit about how scientific publishing fits in that conversation, what publishers and journals can do in this area, and then the main part of the presentation is going to be some examples of journal DEI initiatives. I actually have quite a lot here, but I'm just going to focus in on a few, and then I'm going to finish with some implementation challenges. So why is it important in research? Well, I think the lack of diversity, inclusion, and equity definitely cause bias, discrimination, and inclusion, and that's in kind of three well, at least 3 areas, should we say. So for the research in terms of their entry opportunities to advance and excel in their careers, then the range of research questions asked, so the research itself, and then the equitable and impactful outcome of research. And I think it's important to harness the contributions as a result of that. It's so, because it has such wide-ranging implications, harness the contribution of all stakeholders to have some kind of lasting impact on this issue. And publishers can contribute by promoting diversity and inclusion, and from our perspective, we feel it's important to take an evidence-based approach, have a coordinated set of actions across publishers, and I'll cover more about that later, and have initiatives that are informed by data. And this is just one example. I'm sure you could have many others, and my thanks to my colleagues at the Lancet for this vicious cycle that's disadvantaging women. You could pretty much start anywhere in this cycle, I think, but if you start on the right, with poor participation as peer reviewers and authors for women, leading to fewer publications, leading to less funding and awards and less advancement and promotion, and then poor representation in research. And so the cycle continues. And then how scientific publishing fits into the DEI conversation. I suppose what you have in the middle there is the sort of the research process, and my thanks to Kale Lim especially, and Dr. Shirley Sirios from Cell Press for this, which I've also shamelessly plagiarized, I'm sorry. But the research question, hypothesize, experiment, analysis, conclusion, publication of research. So, are the experiments controlled? Do the experiments consider sample diversity? Are we publishing research that's framed in an unbiased manner? Are the observations drawn in an unbiased manner? And then, is at the core of that, I guess, for publications is our peer review process fair and unbiased? And are we promoting the work of diverse scientists? So I'm sure I'm preaching to the converted here, but I just wanted to cover that as a start. So what publishers and journals can do, I think high-level commitment is really important, and I think we're really lucky at Elsevier. Our CEO, Kumsal Bayezid, is very committed to this area and has made it one of her priorities since joining, and that's not only within Elsevier in terms of it being an inclusive and diverse place to work, but also in terms of the markets that we serve. So there's a lot of commitment there from the top, which I think is really necessary. And as part of that, we have an inclusion and diversity board, which provides direction and guidance and drives accountability in this area. And whilst that was initially focused on gender equality, it now has broad intersectionality, and also initially focused on research and the research community and what difference we can make in that area. But the interest is now expanding to the Elsevier employee community as well. And I think the other thing, and I alluded to this before, that we can do is to work together. And the Royal Society of Chemistry has a fantastic initiative here, a joint commitment for action on inclusion and diversity in publishing. You're probably all aware of it already. So that's got 43 publishers, society signatories working together. And whilst they acknowledge that biases exist in scholarly publishing, they're really committed to scrutinizing these processes and minimizing the effects that they have. And I think there's several subgroups. Data collection is a massive issue, and I'll cover it a little bit later in terms of developing the questionnaires, the schemas that you want to collect the data with, and the technology and platform, and there's also policies as well. So I'm sure that'll become more developed in future times, and I think it's a great initiative to work across publishers so that we have something that's a joint policy rather than a piecemeal approach. So my focus on this is journal level initiatives, and I've broken it down into 4 sections. I'm sure you could break it down into other areas as well, but just these are the ones that I'm going to focus on today. Diversifying editorial teams, diversifying reviewers and authors, and the two there I think are pretty connected. Reviewing editorial policies and guidelines, and also reviewing the content and encouraging content in this area that sort of challenges the status quo. So this is just a smattering of examples at Elsevier, and I won't go into any details here, but what we've done here is broken it down into the kind of core Elsevier journals. and then the initiatives that our colleagues at Cell Press and The Lancet have been moving forward with, and I think they're pretty advanced in many areas, and I'll be picking out some examples, but especially in terms of the partnerships and the content that they've published and the groups that they've put together at The Lancet. And then I'll be covering some of the Elsevier initiatives. We're all one company, but for some reason I'm giving you three different lists there. So if we look at the examples, number one, diversifying the editorial team. So this is something that we've really just started. We're in the very early stages of at Elsevier, which is to request self-reported gender data from editors. And 500 journals now display that self-reported data on the journal homepages. Now, it's self-reported, so the response rate is low, and I think there are still some issues to address in terms of making everyone aware of what percentage actually have responded, and also we're trying to benchmark against subject areas, but there's some work to do there as well. There's work to do everywhere, but I think it's a great start, and we also now display the geographical breakdown of the editorial board on the journal homepage as well. And we've been in discussion with our editors to see whether we need to set gender targets for the editorial teams, and some journals, actually 500 or so, have now published a diversity and inclusion statement, and there's an example there on the bottom right to set gender targets. So we measure the progress we're making quarter to quarter, year to year, and we definitely are improving, but there's still such a long way to go. But I think, as I mentioned, we're just at the beginning of the journey here. So this is an example of diversifying the editorial team at a sort of a journal level for a mentoring program. In this journal, Heart, Lung and Circulation is published on behalf of a couple of societies down here in Australia, and I have to acknowledge Dr. Anne Gregory, the commissioning editor, for really spearheading this initiative and moving it forward. So essentially, we're trying to encourage up-and-coming researchers to experience working on the journal. So they each have a section editor mentor who provides support and helps them with the peer review process. They're encouraged to attend webinars and courses. And the editorial fellows also get involved with the editorial board meetings and have been involved in special issues. And a couple of them are now actually section editors for the journal. So this has been really interesting and useful, I think, in bringing up-and-coming authors through, rather than just using established experts all the time, encouraging younger generation to join the journal and be involved in the journal. It's also been pretty successful in attracting both clinicians and scientists, so mostly, in an area like cardiology. And we do have an issue with the gender balance of this journal, the editorial team. So it's really brought through more younger women to be involved with the journal, which I think is really positive. I'm sure there are many other examples out there. This is just one that I'm familiar with. And as I say, none of the work is mine. It's all down to Anne Gregory and the section editors, but I just thought I'd mention it as an example. So if you move on to number two of my four areas, diversifying reviewers, although I think, as I said, there's an overlap between the first two. We've launched a new feature, Volunteer to Review, back in last year, that's 2020. So this is just coming out of its pilot phase. So essentially reviewers on our platform Reviewer Hub find a journal that they're interested in, they fill out a profile and they say they're interested in becoming a reviewer. So they're then matched to the editors of the same journal, and they have an opportunity to pick them as they would pick any reviewers. I think this also addresses the issues how hard it is to find reviewers. So it's good from that perspective as well. So the pilots resulted in really high acceptance rates and response rates and completion rates as well. So that's really good to see. It's now being scaled up. So it'll be interesting to see how we go in that space going forward. And then also on diversifying reviewers and authors, The Lancet is pretty advanced in this area. It's reports to readers progress on proportion of reviewers and authors that are women, and they also currently aim to have at least one woman reviewer per article, and they're kind of being accountable and letting their audience know how they're tracking with this. For the core Elsevier journals, we're planning to start inviting reviewers and authors to share their gender identity within a peer review system. We need to make sure this is all done in accordance with GDPR and other privacy policies, and that data is managed confidentially, and that reporting is only at an aggregate level. So there's a lot to get right in this area, and that's also just for gender. And we also need to address additional dimensions of diversity and inclusion. So race and ethnicity, I think, is a schema that's being developed, and that has its own challenges as well. And we've also published some best practice guidelines. So if we move to the third pillar, reviewing editorial policies and guidelines, I think you're probably all aware of the Cell Press inclusion and diversity statements. So essentially, scientists who publish in Cell Press journals have the option to include a short statement with the published article if their article is accepted, or on acceptance they're asked. So essentially, the thing on the right-hand side of the screen, they complete checkboxes. So the inclusion and diversity can relate to the scientific content of the paper or to the authorship and attribution of the paper. And this was introduced in February 2021, really just a pilot. I think there's a lot of learning going on. There's a relatively small take-up, I have to say, at the moment, but I think that, there's some really positive feedback, but there was also some negative feedback. You've got issues around, is the contributing author, the right person to be providing this information on behalf of authors? Is that even inclusive? So there is definitely some areas here that need further exploration, but I think it's a great initiative to get things started in this area. And then there's a few other editorial policies and guidelines. The name change policy. So we introduced a trans inclusive name change policy back in March. And in August, we joined a partnership of US publishers to help, which essentially helps trans scholars pursue name changes across their entire publication range rather than having to visit every single publisher. So I think that's a really, really positive thing. We've also been involved in some STM working group around peer review terminology. We're working to introduce the SEGA guidelines for relevant journals. So that's another project in terms of reviewing editorial policies, and there are others there, but I'm just highlighting a few. So then the final point is encouraging content. So there's publishers. There's not just Elsevier that's done stuff in this area. I get that. I know there's a lot of other things. I'm just giving you Elsevier's examples, but I know B&J and others have been really active in this area as well. So the Cell and the Lancet have published a lot of editorials and commentaries and discussions and special issues, just kind of calling out the issue here. And our local journals here, Journal of Physiotherapy and Journal of Science and Medicine in Sport, have also published editorials and had research submitted about representation of women in research. And the journal that I mentioned before, Heart, Lung and Circulation, has also published an issue on women's heart health, which is very under-researched area of study, which is really surprising but disappointing, but it's great that it's now receiving more attention. And we've also published the gender report at Elsevier as well. And like I say, there's so many other examples from other publishers, but I think it's some really great initiatives there. So finally, the implementation challenges. I kind of alluded to this as I was going along. So we're dependent upon self-reported data, and the amount of self-reported data you get is relatively low. And we also need to make sure users feel safe. And well, in order to bring it up, we need to make sure users feel safe to provide the data and also provide data that's meaningful to them. So we need to have a schema that makes sense to users. I think we're getting there with gender. Race and ethnicity is a challenging one, especially to cope with, across the world, different expectations across the world. But I know work is going on behind the scenes in that area. We also need to update customer-facing systems so that they enable self-reporting, and then we need to ensure that data is stored in a GDPR compliant way, and also assure users that that's the case, and that it will only be reported on an aggregate level and is accessible to the users so that they can update it themselves. So many challenges in collecting the data in the first place. There's also, I think, the challenge across publishing, which is to overcome the challenge of similar names. and allowing for differences in the distribution of identity attributes across fields. And finally, keep coming back to this, I think, ensuring alignment between journals and publishers to drive general policy change, so we don't have a piecemeal approach kind of with different publishers. So I think it's important. This RSC joint commitment is so important in this area. And then I've got some more information here. I thought the slides would be circulated, but maybe not. But if you are interested, I'm sure we can let you know. Otherwise, I'm sure the Google can find most of these things. But if you have any questions about these or want more information, I'd be more than happy to provide them. I thought I'd just finish with a quote from our CEO, which is I've mentioned before, but really just to highlight there's no single solution, and everybody needs to come together to drive change. And also, we're really just at the beginning of the journey here. But I think there's been quite some progress in the last couple of years. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Diana. So I just figured that was a good note to move over to our poll. So, the question was, have your organization already implemented journal DEI initiatives? And we were at almost 89% of yes. So moving on the idea that it's a journey and that, we're just at the beginning and that it takes all of us, that's a good sign that many different organizations are working toward that together. So. All right, so we're going to move over to Brit now. So go ahead and share your slides.
All right, excellent. All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Brit Stamey. I'm the Copying Services Coordinator at J&J Editorial. It's great to hear from the poll that we have so many folks already getting their companies or their organizations involved in DEI stuff. I hope that my presentation is helpful for those of you who are maybe more at the beginning of the journey. Although I also, Diana set me up for success here because my theme of my, as I was going through my slides, I realized my theme was definitely that this is a team effort. So I'm glad that we've already brought up the RSC's initiatives. I think it's really important that we all kind of be in this together. So I'm glad that she already set me up with that. So J&J, a little about my company, is a publishing vendor services company. We provide editorial, copy editing, production, system support, and consulting services. And we're based out of Cary, North Carolina in the United States. So because we're a vendor services company and provide services to such a variety of clients versus a small publisher or large publisher or a society, we're positioned uniquely to advise on diversity, equity, and inclusion best practices to our clients, as well as our internal staff from a wide variety of angles. In addition, a little bit more about me. I'm also the founder and chair of J&J's Diversity and Inclusion Council, the treasurer and representative from ISMTE to C4DISC, which is the Coalition for Diversity and Inclusion in Scholarly Communications, another group effort. And I'm actively involved in DEI work for the Council of Science Editors, CSE, as well as ACES, the Society for Editing. Is more than enough about me. So let's dive into a little bit more about the council at J&J and how we work with our clients. So my presentation is going to be about how our company created our internal diversity and inclusion council, what that has helped us achieve both internally and externally with our clients, and some practical tips along the way for weaving DEI best practices and initiatives that are important to your communities and fields into your editorial offices. So as our company has grown, our executive leadership team identified a need to have a more formal process for ensuring our policies were inclusive to our current staff and that we continue to increase the diversity of our staff, both for new employees and internal promotions. Coming from a pretty small company when I started at J&J to growing into, I think we're close to 180 employees now, which is still small, but a lot bigger than when I started. It's been really important to formalize some of this. And the creation of the council was an important part of our strategic planning. It also intended to allow us to better advise our clients about DEI best practices, which was something we thought was very important. We began meeting in September 2020, and we currently meet each month to assess current initiatives, evaluate new projects, and consider requests from other committees and the executive leadership team for assistance, which is something that's really important for the council as well, that we're a sort of a hub for DEI at J&J and offer a place for people to ask questions. So before launching the council, we spent a lot of time researching DEI efforts in scholarly publishing. We also talked to other companies in our space about how they had launched similar initiatives and any lessons they've learned that they were comfortable sharing with us. It was really important to us that the council meet the needs of our staff directly. So we also put together and worked with our HR consultant to make a survey for our staff to ask how they felt about the company's current inclusiveness and ideas that they had for projects for the council to work on. And part of our application process is also asking folks who are interested in the council what they think the council should work on, so that we're making sure that we get that information directly from staff. And we share all of that information that comes from the survey with the council once they're selected. Researching ahead of time and working with other companies provided us a baseline for our own plans and also solidified how much of a community effort DEI should be. To select members to the council, we put together an application process for our purposes, just some stuff about our specific council, but might be interesting for folks who are looking to start something at their own council or committee at their own organization. For our purposes, any employee who had been with the company for 6 months or more was eligible to apply. And anyone who were not selected were eligible the next selection process. And as I mentioned, part of the application process, which was really important to us, was making sure that we asked what folks wanted to work on and what they thought the council should work on, so that we could make sure that we were getting the information directly from staff about what they thought we needed to be working on with the council. The final selections were made with an effort to ensure that appointments included employees from a variety of roles, length of services, and divisions of the company to ensure that it was representing a good portion of the company. It's important to make sure that if your organization, if you're organizing a council or committee, that it represents the makeup of your organization, its diverse population, and also that it addresses the needs of the community that it serves. So if you're thinking about your organization, it can be a little bit complicated because you want to make sure that you're meeting the needs both of your internal staff, as Diana kind of touched on in her presentation too, but also of the communities that you're serving as a scholarly publisher or society. So some of our first tasks were pretty boring ones, figuring out how often we wanted to meet, what the scope of the council was, keeping the company updated on what we were working on. These were all important things to work on in the early days of the council to make sure we were setting ourselves up for success later and really begin to integrate the council into the company culture as a whole, which since we're still in the early days, we're still working on. And in particular, we've made a concerted effort to communicate what events were co-sponsored by the council or what projects the council was working on to make sure the wider company was aware of what that involvement looked like and could also, again, continue to offer us ideas and ask questions about what we were working on and make sure that it was representing what they thought we should be working on. Weaving DEI throughout policies, documentation in your organization is an important component to any success of D&I initiatives, I think. They can't live in a vacuum or exist outside of other processes. They really need to be tied into all of your documentation, policies, committees, and leadership members need to be champions of those policies that you've put into place as well. This is just a selection of some projects we've worked on so far. They've included internal projects like reviewing our internal documents and policies for inclusive language, providing liaisons to other committees at J&J, as well as external projects like adopting the C4DISC principles, which I mentioned. C4DISC earlier is an organization that we're really involved with, as well as working with our clients on DEI initiatives, which I'll talk about in a moment. Building momentum by working on smaller projects might not be the most exciting way to start, but it's important to be realistic, I think, about your DEI projects and goals and not to let perfection get in the way of progress. So don't let setting too high of goals or starting on projects that are too large keep you from being able to move through projects that might be smaller, less glamorous, but of real value to your organization and community. So a lot of what we've done so far has been working behind the scenes, maybe things that are a little less exciting, but things that have really made a difference by working behind the scenes and integrating things into policies. Oops. So adding DEI best practices as another aspect of client work, as I mentioned, has been an important facet to our council's work as well. We wanted to make sure that what we were doing internally is really important, but also that we were working externally with our clients and editorial offices. So this has given us an important role to play with our clients in advising on their policies and upholding their own work and making sure that we're supporting DEI work that they might already be working on. So one case study is our working with a university publisher client. They reached out to us to ask what we had been working on related to DEI internally because they were currently evaluating their own internal practices and wanted to make sure that those aligned. In particular, they wanted to make sure that as a partner organization, our values aligned and that we had taken concrete steps in similar ways to what they had done to promote diversity and inclusion internally and externally. So we started a real partnership with them by having first a conversation about what each of our companies were doing, and then continued that by including one another in our DEI meetings and updating one another on our projects. And also, a really important point here, sharing resources with one another's organizations. So a lot of the documentation that they had pulled together, they shared with us, and vice versa. We gave a lot of our documentation and resources that we had made over to them. This enabled both of the groups to better meet our DEI goals and see DEI as a team effort. See, I promised I would talk about it a lot, rather than something that is to be competitive about, which I think is a really important point. And C4DISC is another important organization, as well as the RSC, who are really diving into pushing that DEI mentality that it's a team effort. It's an ever evolving and changing field as well. It has far reaching implications. So keeping close contact with other organizations who are working on similar projects is a really important way to keep yourself and your organization updated, to share resources with similar organizations, and to make sure that everyone's on the same page and you're not reinventing the wheel. And if someone is working on something, it can be a team effort that you work on together instead of working alone. So another project we recently worked on was creating a template for if a client has specific verbiage about treatment of race or ethnicity in their style guide that differs from recent changes to their overarching style guide. You can tell I'm a copy editor from this example. So for example, if their guidance differs from Chicago Manual of Style, but the overarching style guide they use for their journal articles is based on CMOS, that's one example of how we've encountered this happening with a lot of our journals. So these are important and timely changes, and they've become increasingly common and visible in recent years and months. So we've been working with our clients to help them be proactive about these changes and understand how to best adjust their style guides when needed and how it makes sense for their particular field to do that. This has also assisted our staff by providing them with easy documentation that they can point to when issues arise. So having documentation and policies readily available for staff enables them to more easily and quickly answer questions that clients have. So this makes it really easy for our copy editors when they get a question about something like this to say, oh, I have, an email template already ready for that. I can bring that over right to you so we can make that change for you. DEI policies can often be about sensitive and evolving topics, so readying your staff with documentation and talking points will set them up for success. Another project our council has worked on is contributing to externally facing blogs. So this is again in the service of treating DEI and scholarly publishing as a team effort, including topics like inclusive language for copy editors and best practices for writing and editing about gender and scholarly publishing, which we've promoted on our website. This is an important aspect of DEI to our company since we want to make sure that our efforts in the DEI space reach our clients, but also a wider range of folks in the scholarly publishing community. So these are freely available on our site, which I think is a really important point. So for my wrap up, you've heard me say team effort many, many times. So my real wrap up here is that I think the goal of every organization in DEI efforts is to make editorial offices as a whole better and make scholarly publishing and research as a whole better. Working in DEI is ever changing and it can be difficult, but it's also extremely important and rewarding work that can and should feed into everything that we do. And the needs of every organization when it comes to DEI will be really different. So hopefully looking at some of what myself and Diana have worked on will give you sort of a baseline of what might be important as starting points for determining what is needed to improve your specific organization and its surrounding community. From internal committees to editorial boards and to medical papers and scientific studies, the scholarly publishing community is uniquely placed to address DEI from a wide range of angles and can do so much better by working together and seeing DEI as something to be addressed by and for the community as a whole. So thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Britt. Thanks, Diana. Really appreciate your comments. I think that was really interesting, really great examples of DEI across both, a variety of different publications and from different viewpoints. So this is the time for questions. So audience, please feel free to enter any questions that you have in our Q&A function. We have about 10 minutes left and we can answer anything that you all might have. While you all are thinking of that, I figured I'd go ahead and throw a question in. So some folks in our audiences that work on maybe some smaller journals or journals that don't have as many resources, or whether resource be money or time, people, what would be sort of a baseline of entry into being able to adopt some different DEI efforts internally without either breaking the bank or taking time away from people's work? And that can go to either of you.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, we're obviously talking from I'm talking from a big company here. I mean, I think some of those ones about diversifying the editorial teams, just looking at that, and also maybe mentoring programs to bring on more people, and just kind of being aware of that, and discussing it with your editors, or if you are the editor, then thinking about that, I would say. But I think also the RSC initiative, I think it takes all takers, so I would definitely encourage being part of that.
Yeah, I agree. I think the RSC is a great place to start. C4Disc has a lot of resources on their website, which would be a good place to start too. I know C4Disc also gathers both free and paid webinars and things from its members in one place on their website. So from ISMTE, from CSE, from all different kinds of scholarly publication communities that put out these webinars that you can maybe watch while you're also working, which is what I often do, especially when you're short on time. So I think that would be a good place to start if you're looking to educate yourself a little bit too, or get something started at your organization. That's a good place to start. That's low cost, and also you can kind of listen to in the background maybe while you're getting stuff done if you don't have a lot of time.
Yeah, thanks, Brit. And Brit's mentioned C4Disc a couple times. We will actually have a session during tomorrow's program, so on the 13th. I can't recall what time, but there will be a presentation on racism toolkits by C4Disc, and there's a lot of information that will be included in that, and sort of some of their efforts that they've been doing. So. All right, both. Well, we don't have any questions that have come in quite yet. So seeing no questions at this point, I just wanted to go ahead and thank our speakers. Thank you both very much. We ended at about 90% of our viewers had adopted some kind of DEI initiative internally. So that's great news, and certainly speaks to a lot of what you all have been talking about here regarding working together and really kind of pulling together as a team effort. So just to end here, for those of you who are social media inclined, feel free to use our hashtag, which is hashtag ISMTE Global, to be able to post and communicate with others about our meeting. I thank so much our speakers today. This was a really great session, and I look forward to all those that are now joining later to watch the recording. So thank you all very much. Enjoy the rest of the program and be well. Thanks.
Thank you.